Waiting for everyone to join. Thank you. Well, super. Why don't we get going? Welcome to Innovating in the Public Interest, Partnering for Public Good. My name's Anita McGahan. I'm a senior research scientist at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. Today is our third out of 6 sessions uh, on working toward innovating or innovating even at innovation for the public good. So our agenda today is going to be thinking about how to get organized finally after doing a lot of preparatory work on trying to think about how to be effective. So a goal here, the workshop series is all about supporting you as public sector innovators who want to make lasting change that improves lives. We have 6 sessions. We began by thinking about how to get started, then about how to score some early wins so that you can show and demonstrate the value of innovating and going through the difficulty of actually implementing change. So achieving those early wins. Today, we're going to be talking about how to actually innovate organizationally so that you can be effective. And then our last few sessions will be on learning and growing and scaling, all of which may seem highly related, but these are very different topics, and I'll talk about that right at the end to try to whet your appetite to return on May 1st, just next week at 2 o'clock. And just to remind you, we're headed towards some in-person workshops for you and your teammates if you want to, get some one-on-one counseling starting in September. So let me begin by talking about where we've been so far. So the goal of our workshop series here is to support you in thinking about how to take something that's on your desk that you know could be done better and actually implementing some sort of a change that will actually make that process more efficient, more effective, higher quality, deliver better outcomes. So we talked quite a bit about how to get started, how to identify a team, how to make sure that the agenda that you're pursuing reflects your own interests, your own focus, and that you're not actually, taking up an opportunity that's been introduced from outside by someone who doesn't really know what your day-to-day life is about. We talked about busting myths and making sure that, you break through concerns that are particularly unfounded about how change can occur. Talked about tying your agenda to a redefined public good, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that today, and creating success for your partners. So if you've involved someone from outside your immediate organization, you've thought through how to make them successful in the partnership as well. Last time we talked about structuring some early successes so that the team gets some momentum. You have some sense that the project that you're pursuing actually can come to something important. You want to demonstrate your impact, and in particular, to talk about how value could be created through this intervention that you've designed that others may not be fully aware of. So, the idea would be to say, if we do this, we're going to be able to solve a whole bunch of problems that can't be solved in any better way. And then build a shared understanding of that impact by involving people who might be skeptics in the construction of, evidence that what you're about to do is going to be worthwhile. So all of this is pre-work before you actually start to actually design the intervention. Finally, here we are. It's workshop number 3, and now we're going to start to think about actually implementing the kind of change you envision. We're going to be talking about organizational design challenges and actually implementing something. It could be AI, it could be any technological change, it could really be any type of change. We tend to, in Innovate US, think about AI implementation, so I'll focus on that as an example, but there are many, many types of change that you could pursue that may involve, for example, automation or the introduction of technology altogether, like the new piece of software here. And the goal here is to begin by starting to think about how you're going to get organized. And what does it mean to be organized or to start to get organized? It means to start to think about things like, what are our goals going to be? How are we going to articulate those? What kinds of incentives do we want, to emphasize and to implement in order to provide a kind of some energy to the effort? How are we going to measure outcomes? How do we know if we're being successful? How can we assess the performance of contributors and make sure we're improving value? How can we experiment? How can we scale? What kinds of stages of change are we going to go through? So there's many, many things to consider. I'm going to go up first to 30,000 feet and offer you the idea that the best way to begin is through gaffer's tape and Band-Aids. And I can just hear Agata laughing at me here or Jess laughing at me here as I talk about gaffer's tape and Band-Aids. What I mean by that is I'd like you to start by just cobbling together, you know, a jury-rigged uh, implementation of the intervention to see what happens before you actually build a whole organizational apparatus around the intervention. So let me explain why that is important here. So just to review here, you know, someone famous once said that when we focus on technology, implementing something technological or putting in place some sort of a change in the structure of the way work is done, when we focus on that rather than the outcomes that we're shooting for, then we can get distracted. We can get distracted by technological problems, and we can lose energy to focus on the whole purpose of what we're trying to accomplish together, the whole purpose of innovation. In other words, trying to construct the perfect, AI implementation or the perfect technological implementation can prevent you from having impact on the outputs that are important. So when you think about X and Y, something that we talked a lot about last time, thinking about how to design experiments, we talked about focusing and motivating the change by focusing on the why, the objective here. So it's critical to constantly be thinking about what is the big picture here on what we're trying to accomplish, and when can we come up with an intervention or an input, an X, that's good enough to get us to where we need to go. So instead of focusing primarily or exclusively on things like, what are we investing in? What are the tech choices that we're going for? What are the implementation plans that we want? Instead, we turn our attention to what's our mission? How do we want to make things better financially? How do we want to improve customer satisfaction or employee retention? You think that achieving the outputs is going to be easy, and that what's hard is actually doing the implementation. But what turns out to be true is that the way in which you frame your goals or your outputs has a big impact on the way that the intervention is accepted in the organization. So what we want to do is make sure that there's a kind of constant reflection back onto the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish by doing that. Now, the reason that we focus today on organizations and organizational structure is because it's organizational structure that gets you from inputs to outputs. Now, in large organizations like the ones that are represented by those of you in the room here, organizations, especially in public service, especially in government, tend to reflect settled routines. You've made something, you've created a process that has been tested, it's been vetted. That process may be very old. It may have been implemented decades ago, and it often will reflect historical resolutions of trade-offs in values. So think back to, the way that for example, a computer system was put in place to run the registry of motor vehicles in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And let's say that system, I don't know when that system was implemented in Massachusetts, but just as an example, let's imagine that it was put in the 1980s. And let's imagine that when the system was originally designed for renewing driver's licenses and, registrations and things like that, the core system, that the system was designed for accountability and transparency and fairness and stability and efficiency. And the whole process by which we renew our driver's licenses in the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was very successful, successfully implemented around those values. Okay, so what constitutes quality, let's say, in the running of the registry of motor vehicles is, highly efficient, automated, well vetted, and well documented renewals of things like our driver's licenses and our vehicle registrations. You come in and let's imagine that you've got some sort of new AI-based approach that can make the system, let's say, more efficient and potentially, possibly also fairer. You instead of having fewer exceptions where people who are missing little pieces of documentation have trouble, let's say the new AI system that's proposed will facilitate renewals even when documentation is imperfect, let's say, because there's an AI-driven engine that reassures you that the person is legit and eligible for a renewal here. We need to keep our eye on the impact of a proposed intervention like this on the values that the system is designed to support. So somebody may object to the implementation of a new technology like that, not on technological terms, but out of worries that there could be risk-taking. It could be risky because someone might get their driver's license renewed who truly should not have it renewed. Or let's say somebody might feel like this is going to encourage bad behavior. It's going to encourage people not to have their documentation in order when they process their renewals. And it is those value-based objections that often get in the way of successful implementations. So we need to be ready for them. We need to have thought them through, and we need to be managing them and considering them and reflecting on them. So the goal here is to motivate the implementation of some sort of technological intervention by a thoughtful understanding of the potential impact of that on outcomes. Okay, so what we're going to do in our talk today is think through different layers of the kinds of interventions that can occur and the challenges that each type of innovation raises for the way that, high priority outcomes may be trading off against each other. So let's imagine that we start with workflow redesign. Workflow redesign occurs within established units like the Registry of Motor Vehicles, for example, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, within the Social Security Administration, in terms of the running of the software. You can think of claims verification and insurance to make sure that the person who is putting in a claim has actually got insurance coverage for that particular item. Workflow automation of any kind would flow into this category, workflow redesign. And this is our least controversial sort of environment or set of candidates for interventions, because the historical trade-offs between different types of values are not deeply affected by the improvement. So what's happening is with workflow redesign is you're improving efficiency, you're improving access to a particular service, you're just raising the bar on what becomes possible without creating any trade-offs against other types of important goals that may be compromised. So for example, if there's a trade-off between privacy and security, you're improving security, but you're not diminishing privacy, that's a workflow redesign goal. You're improving, let's say, uh, access to a particular type of service without diminishing the reliability of the system. That goes through because that's a workflow flow redesign opportunity because you're not making any element of what's important even marginally worse off. You're just improving the system in a very broad sense here. Okay. The second layer of innovation is a little bit more risky. We can think of this as strategic innovation. This happens also within a unit, but it's more complicated because strategic innovation may vastly improve one kind of element of performance, let's say like privacy, but it may come at the cost of some diminishment in some other output, like security. So you get a lot more privacy, but maybe let's say uh, a little bit more cost of security, or you get, more efficiency, but maybe at the cost of a little bit of reliability. But still, so it needs leadership within a unit to pursue these strategic innovations. They're worth it when the upside way outweighs the downside, but that calculation has to be occurring. And that's what makes strategic innovation different from workflow redesign. Workflow redesign is win-win. Strategic innovation is win, but with a little loss somewhere, and you have to make sure that that's worth it. Structural innovation is introducing new values into the system, new trade-offs. For example, you may say, this is an absurd example, but you might say, we don't need to, a structural innovation would be, we don't need to renew driver's licenses every 5 years anymore. Once someone gets a driver's license, they can keep it forever. Okay, that would be a structural innovation. And we might say that a change like that can really improve efficiency. It can reduce error. It can allow citizens a better experience of service, but it comes with a lot of different kinds of risk. Like, for example, continuing to believe that somebody is licensed to drive in the Commonwealth when they've moved out of state. Or, it makes permanent, let's say, a mistake that might be on somebody's record. So to do something that's structurally innovative, you need a sort of very broad rethinking of whether or not the performance outcomes that are supported by that innovation are really going to be worth it here. So when we think about these three categories of innovations, we're thinking about three basic types of redesign, okay, of redesign. So examples of workflow redesign that are occurring within each individual unit include, we call them point solutions, includes things like fraud detection and claims verification and generalized automation. Okay. Strategic innovation at the level of individual units may make some much bigger than others. It may rebalance the organization as a whole. Examples of this would be the introduction of new products and services, or a very different way of doing resource management or capability creation that actually makes one unit much bigger and more robust than others. So, for example, you might think in a branch of government that one type of service will become very dominant over others. Over the past, I don't know, I think it was something like 40 years, Medicare and Medicaid have become very, very large, important services federally compared to some other services that have either stayed relatively stable in terms of the size of their offerings or even faded in their significance. And the rebalancing across the organization ultimately has consequences for resource allocation, for the attraction of personnel, for growth, and so on. Nonetheless, these can be relatively stable sort of innovations in the sense that the structure can be readily managed and the organizational units can handle the trade-offs because any diminished performance is relatively small compared to what's achieved. On the structural side, we get a blowing up of the entire enterprise of what's being accomplished here. Examples of this in the real world, in the world that I live in, in the private sector are called they're called system solutions, would be, Uber overtaking taxi services, online gaming taking over console gaming, semiconductors uh, taking over from transistors, the Model T Ford taking over from the horse and buggy, the introduction of electricity over non-electrified lighting systems. And all of these had profound implications for really the organization of society in a much broader sense than only the intervention itself. And what's happening is you're supporting that whole ecosystem of change because the potential for value creation is just so great. So we've got three different kind of ways in which you can conceptualize what you're trying to accomplish with an innovation. So uh, fascinating. I've been teaching quite a bit about AI and AI implementation in my classrooms. And, here's some broad strokes on the level of commitment that's needed to accomplish each of these three types of innovation. For workflow redesign, you're thinking about something that you can deploy within the next year, 12 months. You're looking for, let's say, a 10 to 20% productivity gain on average with a 2-year payback. So there may be some period of discomfort and retraining and things like that, but it's relatively quick. There's no fundamental change in the workflow, and you can get unit heads to implement. Strategic innovation, we're talking 2 to 3 years, but a much larger productivity gain. If you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of performance on a subsidiary element of what's valued, like you're willing to give up a little bit of efficiency or a little bit of quality, or you're willing to take a little more risk, you may be able to create headroom for a big productivity gain in some other element of performance. So we sacrifice a little efficiency, but we get a lot more quality, or vice versa. Or, we sacrifice a little security, but we get a ton more information that can inform innovation. The payback period on strategic innovation like this can be 2 to 10 years. You're extending from the established workflow. It's often with new services or products, like Medicare and Medicaid were. And it has to be led not just by unit heads, but also by a chief executive officer, a head of department, somebody who is charged with a very broad level of responsibility for organization design. On the structural side, we're talking 3 to 5 years, a big productivity gain that can start at 300% and go way above 500. You're looking at 5 to 20 years. Many people don't know that organizations like Uber and Netflix, even Amazon and Google, OpenAI, have taken many, many years to even begin to be part of the public conversation about the provision of the services they offer. This is a fundamental change in workflow. It has to be led by a senior leader with very broad organizational responsibility and a lot of depth in terms of understanding the technology and understanding what's important to various constituencies here. So as you think about which one of these kinds of innovations you want to pursue, it's worthwhile to understand the greatest barriers to technology adoption are not usually technical. The greatest barriers to technology adoption are usually organizational and cultural, and thinking through the organizational and economic and cultural implications of what you're asking people to do can be critically important to the success of the effort altogether. So for workflow redesign, it's the least risky, it's the quickest to get to fruition, and so it's the place that we often advise colleagues to begin. Because what you can do through a successful workflow redesign project is build a team, start to disseminate understanding of what a technology has to offer, but perhaps even most importantly, begin a conversation about what trade-offs we're willing to accept in different elements of organizational performance, those outcomes. What are we willing to live with in terms of possibly, making some compromises? Can we, in the healthcare sector, a lot of change is blocked by physician concern about patient risk. We don't want to get rid of checklists, even if nobody really seems to rely on these checklists very much anymore. We don't want to get rid of them because we don't want to risk a mistake that somebody, takes out the left kidney when it's the right kidney that had to be removed. Okay? We cannot tolerate that risk. So what you're doing with workflow redesign is you're accepting that that value is going to stay in place, and you're trying to improve the system for assuring that the outcomes that are important are fulfilled. What you may learn through that process of workflow redesign, such as I'm describing about kidney transplantation, is that the mistaking of left for right kidney removals almost never happens. In fact, you may be able to document that it never happens, that the systems are in place. There's backstopping of systems that makes that really a very uh, a very remote risk compared to some other risks that may arise more frequently. And let's say there's the risk that somebody's sick and doesn't show up. You don't have a second nurse. You don't have a second pair of hands, a second pair of eyes. That let's say you develop evidence that infection is a greater risk than taking out the wrong kidney, and you document that through the workflow redesign project. You can then motivate strategic innovation at the organizational level by saying, you know what? Instead of prioritizing left versus right kidney, let's prioritize infection control. And that can lead you potentially to diminishing the importance of checking that you're getting the right kidney compared to checking whether or not you're preserving the sanitation needed to prevent infection. But the payoff is greater. So you get much better outcomes after having learned through workflow redesign that you can reduce the importance of one goal versus another. And that's the sense in which workflow redesign can start to support strategic innovation. Here, we want to start to think about the implications of strategic innovation for the overall architecture. So let's talk a little bit about Netflix. Netflix, as you may remember, began by signing up for people to get DVDs in the mail. You would create on your website a list of all the DVDs that you wanted, and they would send you the DVDs that were in stock based on their order on your list. Okay? Today, Netflix no longer signs people up to get DVDs in the mail. There are still some customers out there that do get DVDs in the mail, but there are fewer and fewer, and the goal for Netflix is to shut down that division. What's happened is, over time, the division that does DVDs through the mail started to transfer its customers over to doing streaming services, so getting people to sign up for subscriptions. Certainly in my family, we still have a subscription to Netflix as a streaming service. That streaming service, represented by the middle box, gave way to a production department that started to produce videos, represented by the left-hand box. Today, what's happening with Netflix is the production and distribution function of Netflix is greatly expanded compared even to streaming services. So what Netflix is becoming better and better at and amplifying more and more as part of its business model is going and finding great content, commissioning the production of new shows, new series, going in to film festivals, finding obscure directors, producers, and content, and bringing it into the Netflix family, and really, moving away from the old streaming service, much less DVDs by mail. So you're starting to get this shift in the nature of Netflix's business that reflects this kind of strategic innovation that's accumulated through technology change over time. That positions the organization for structural innovation. So what is structural innovation? Structural innovation would occur at Netflix if it shut down the DVD by mail division altogether, which it's in the process of doing. If it says, look, streaming services are really ancillary now to the production business. The whole game here is in production. And what we really want to be great at is being a producer of content that people want to watch. And this has not yet happened yet with Netflix, but I predict that it could happen, which is if Netflix becomes better than anybody at finding great content and sponsoring great quirky little shows and things like that, it could actually start to supply content to its competitors. It's moved back into the production process far enough that it's specializing as in a distributor of materials, and that it may find distribution not just in its own streaming subscription services, but also in that of competitors. And that kind of rethinking of the way that value gets created means setting aside a lot of secondary performance goals along the way to a much bigger pie of value that the organization can create over time. We've got some examples of this in uh, uh, that may be interesting to you. People talk about Uber all the time as a structural innovator in the taxi business. Uber started de novo. It started from scratch, and so it didn't have to go through an organizational transformation of the kind that I've just described for Netflix to get there. But it nonetheless did have to go through some change, and in particular to grow from its initial cities into other cities and deal with challenges from traditional taxi companies and get good at that and move forward. Another example would be the provision of electricity. Thomas Edison comes up with the light bulb. Well, the light bulb is not the invention in and of itself. We need the entire architecture of the distribution of electricity first on wires that are strung from telephone poles and across cities. Over time, we need electric generating stations, transformers, all sorts of complementary technologies have to emerge. The thing has to be made safe. It has to be regulated. The rates have to be regulated. That entire ecosystem of public activity that occurs around this innovation in the late 19th century is often passes from our view as important, but it's actually critical to the way that we experience electricity even today. And the structural innovation that accompanied the dissemination of electricity is so profound that we almost take it for granted, but it didn't happen automatically. The innovations were driven by insights about the value that electricity could create that required a lot of argumentation and support and effort to implement. Other examples would be, the Model T Ford, the ecosystem built around the Model T Ford and the structural innovation went way beyond the assembly line to things like the interstate highway systems, the macadam roadways, the gas station infrastructure that we now take as given, the entire apparatus of repair shops, dealers, all of that emerged as entrepreneurs, both in government and in the private sector, saw opportunity to actually create value, and in the private sector side to profit from that value eventually over time. And I could give you modern examples, the iPhone. You can come up with 1,000 examples around AI itself. The key for us is to get from here to that kind of massive structural or strategic innovation. What you want to do is begin with workflow redesign, build your team, get your organization more comfortable and familiar, not just with the technology itself, but also with the kinds of trade-offs in performance outcomes that are going to be implicated by change, so that you can start to think about where can we compromise? Where do we have room and appetite for really big improvements that may come at a little bit of a cost, but not such a big cost that we don't want to incur those trade-offs here. And I want to talk with you a little bit about your own experience in trying to implement change. But before I do, let me just stop here for sharing my screen for a second. Excuse me there. And turn to any questions that people may have so far. Agata, do you see any in the chat that
Yes,
we could
there are
raise in at
questions.
this moment?
Yes, there are questions, and I am at this very moment. I mean, there are a lot of questions. Okay.
Good.
Okay, so I have one question from Chetan Mahajan. Mahajan, I'm hope I'm pronouncing the name not too bad. So, workflow redesign. Do you see the risk increasing significantly when the redesign impacts the political structures or chain of control and command involved in, say, sign-off, approvals, etc.? Or does it have some overlay with strategic and structural innovation so that then reflects increased risk?
So yeah, I mean, my view is that everything is political at some level. And one of the advantages of starting with workflow redesign is, what you're doing is looking for opportunities to really improve value without many trade-offs. Everybody agrees that, you don't want to be in the health system here in Ontario, that you don't want to be communicating orders for follow-up tests for patients using fax machines, that those orders ought to be conveyed by electronically through the medical record. I had actually quite a nice and long conversation with our wonderful colleague Jess Silverman on a new Innovate US podcast that she has just launched, I believe, in the last day or two, that I recommend to you. And we talked about these fax machines in Ontario and how they're written into Ontario law. And if you want to, as a physician, order a follow-up test for a kidney transplant patient or any patient, you have to fax over an order. And the reason you have to do that is because that's required by law. Everybody agrees that this is not optimal anymore. Fax technology is ridiculously outdated. And yet, if you asked any physician what's their most important innovation opportunity, nobody would say the fax machines should be replaced. They've got other priorities that they want to work on, like, for example, getting access to synthetic organs or getting access to a greater number of healthy organs for transplantation in the case of a kidney specialist. So these innovation opportunities in workflow redesign are not political in the sense that you're looking for places to get rid of waste, to take up new service opportunity where, the upside is so great and the downside is so limited that really all politicians agree. Thanks, Agata. Any others that are
Yes.
hitting you?
I have a question from Patul who says, if the DMV wants to improve customer experience at the expense of efficiency, where would this fall on the spectrum? How would you quantify the impact/gains of something intangible?
And may I ask the person who asked this question to unmute, please? I have a quick question for you. And what's the person's name, Agata, please?